There is a bargain at the foundation of every republic that is never written into its constitution and without which no constitution holds. It is not a contract. It is not a clause. It is the understanding, older than any particular government, that the citizen who bears the republic's burdens will share in the republic's rewards. Not wealth, not luxury, a stake, property, or the credible hope of it, dignity, or the structures that protect it, the reasonable expectation that one's children will live no worse than oneself, and perhaps a little better. This is the covenant that holds a republic together. It is not in the Constitution because it does not need to be. It is the gravitational force that keeps the constitutional machinery in orbit. When it fails, the machinery spins free. The American founders understood this. They did not write it down because they were living it. The revolution was not, at bottom, a quarrel over tea or stamps. It was the assertion of a people who had built farms, businesses, churches, and towns on a continent 3,000 miles from the crown that they had earned a voice in the government that taxed them. The Declaration is remembered for its philosophy, but its power came from the fact that the men who signed it had something to lose. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. The pledge meant something because they had fortunes. They had stakes. A republic of stakeholders is not a plutocracy. It is the opposite. A plutocracy concentrates stakes in few hands and governs in their interest. A republic distributes them widely and governs by the argument of those who hold them. The founders were not democrats in the modern sense, but they grasped the structural point. Self-governance requires citizens with skin in the game. A man who owns nothing, owes nothing, and expects nothing from the Commonwealth has no reason to defend it and every reason to sell his allegiance to whoever promises him bread. The Roman Republic did not fall to barbarians. It fell to Romans. And the sequence by which it fell is so precise, so mechanical, that it reads less like history than like an engineering report on structural failure. Rome's Republican bargain was explicit in a way the American one is not. Citizen soldiers fought the Republic's wars, and in return, the Republic guaranteed their land. A man who served his years in the legions returned to a farm that fed his family and gave him standing in the assembly. This was not generosity. It was the load-bearing wall of the Roman Constitution. The soldier who held land had a reason to vote wisely, because policy affected his livelihood. He had a reason to fight, because he was defending something that was his. He had a reason to obey the law, because the law protected what he owned. Remove the land, and you remove the reason. After the Punic Wars, which stretched Roman arms across the Mediterranean for the better part of a century, the soldiers came home to discover that the bargain had been broken in their absence. Senatorial aristocrats had bought up the bankrupt smallholdings and consolidated them into vast estates worked by enslaved laborers taken as spoils of the very wars the citizen soldiers had fought. The veterans who had conquered Carthage returned to find that Carthage's defeat had made them landless. The republic they had defended no longer belonged to them. In 133 BC, a tribune named Tiberius Gracchus proposed land redistribution to restore the covenant. The Senate, whose members held the stolen land, beat him to death on the steps of the Capitol. His brother Gaius took up the cause a decade later and met the same end. The murders established a precedent more corrosive than any policy. The governing class preferred political violence to renegotiation of the economic settlement. Within a generation, Marius had professionalized the army, severing the last link between soldier and soil, binding military loyalty to individual commanders rather than the republic itself. Sulla marched his legions on Rome. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Augustus offered stability in exchange for liberty, and the citizens, who no longer had a reason to prefer liberty, accepted. The republic was not overthrown. It was abandoned by a people for whom it had ceased to function. When Alexis de Tocqueville arrived in America in 1831, the first thing he noticed was not the democracy. It was the equality. Not equality of talent or outcome, but what he called equality of condition, the broad distribution of property, dignity, and social standing that made self-governance plausible. This, he wrote, was the fundamental fact from which all others seemed to be derived. Not the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights, not the tradition of English liberty. The fact that most Americans owned something, expected something, and had something to defend. Tocqueville was not celebrating equality. He was diagnosing a structural prerequisite. His argument was precise. Democratic peoples will tolerate significant losses of freedom as long as equality is maintained, but they will revolt against inequality even when freedom is preserved. A people who feel they have no stake do not participate. They withdraw into private life, tend their own affairs, and leave the business of governance to whoever claims it. This withdrawal, Tocqueville warned, would invite a new form of despotism, one that does not break the will but bends it, does not tyrannize but manages and reduces a free people to a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. The equality of condition Tocqueville observed in the 1830s was not permanent. It was a contingent condition produced by a continent of cheap land and the absence of a hereditary aristocracy. The founders did not earn it. They inherited it, amplified it, and built a constitutional order that assumed its persistence. What they did not build was a mechanism to restore it if it failed. It has failed before. By the close of the 19th century, the covenant was breaking along lines the founders would have recognized as feudal. Railroads, steel, and oil had produced concentrations of private power that rivaled the state itself. A man who worked 12 hours in a Pittsburgh mill owned nothing he could not carry and voted, if he voted at all, in the shadow of the company that owned the town, the store, and the house he rented. The Gilded Age was not a failure of markets. It was a demonstration of what markets produce when the covenant of stakes is left unattended, an aristocracy of capital as rigid and as self-perpetuating as the aristocracy of blood the revolution was fought to escape. And then the Republic did something Rome could not. It renegotiated, not cleanly, not quickly, not without violence and grave error, but structurally, antitrust, the income tax, collective bargaining, the homestead programs, and eventually a post-war settlement that distributed the rewards of American productivity widely enough to rebuild the covenant for a generation. The correction was imperfect. It excluded millions by race and sex. But it demonstrated the principle. The covenant of stakes is not self-sustaining, and when it breaks, it must be rebuilt by political will, or the Republic will follow Rome. It is breaking again. The top 1% of American households now hold nearly a third of the nation's wealth. The bottom half hold 2.5%. 3 out of 4 households cannot afford a median-priced home. The median house costs 5 times the median annual income, and the mortgage payment consumes nearly a third of what the average family earns, up from a fifth just 6 years ago. An entire generation is entering adulthood with student debt where their parents had equity, with rent receipts where their grandparents had deeds. 9 in 10 Americans say they are living through a cost of living crisis. More than half struggle to pay their bills on time each month. These are not complaints. They are structural data. They describe a republic in which the covenant of stakes is dissolving for the majority of its citizens, exactly as it dissolved in Rome when the latifundia swallowed the smallholdings, exactly as it dissolved in the Gilded Age when the trusts swallowed the trades. The machinery of self-governance remains in place. The elections are held, the courts are open, the Constitution endures. But the gravitational force that kept the machinery in orbit is weakening, and Tocqueville told us what comes next. The American right has made a fetish of free markets without reckoning with what unrestrained markets produce. Markets are the most powerful engine of prosperity human beings have devised. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or ought to be, is whether a market that concentrates property into fewer and fewer hands is compatible with the republican form of government that protects its operation. The founders would not have found this a difficult question. They fought a revolution against precisely such concentration. The East India Company was not a government, but it governed. The great estates of the English aristocracy were not kingdoms, but they produced subjects, not citizens. The founders understood, because they had lived under it, that economic feudalism and republican self-governance cannot coexist. One will consume the other. The American left has made a different error, equal in magnitude and opposite in direction. Confronted with the dissolution of the covenant, it proposes programs, subsidies, transfers, expansions of the administrative state, the managed redistribution of resources through bureaucracies whose complexity would have staggered the court of Louis XIV. The impulse is not wrong. The method is fatal. A stipend is not a stake. A benefit check does not make a citizen. It makes a client. The difference is structural, not moral. A citizen with a stake in the republic defends the republic because it is his. A citizen with a stipend from the state defends the program because he depends on it. The first produces self-governance. The second produces what Tocqueville feared, a population that accepts management in exchange for maintenance, that trades liberty for security, that permits an ever-expanding tutelary power to tend its needs on the condition that it need never tend its own. Neither side is solving the problem, because neither side has named it correctly. The problem is not that markets are too free or that government is too small. The problem is that the covenant of stakes has been broken, and no one is proposing to restore it. One side accelerates the concentration that hollows the covenant from above. The other builds dependency that hollows it from below. Both produce the same result: a republic in which fewer and fewer citizens have a material reason to participate in the hard, tedious, unglamorous work of self-governance. Let me be precise about what I mean by stake. A stake is not wealth. The founders were not rich men, by and large. Several died in penury. A stake is ownership of something whose value depends on the health of the commonwealth. A house whose worth rises or falls with the neighborhood. A business whose survival depends on the rule of law. A farm whose productivity depends on functioning infrastructure. A profession whose practice depends on institutions that remain honest. The stakeholder is not wealthy. The stakeholder is invested, in the literal and ancient sense, clothed in the republic, wearing it, unable to separate his own fate from the fate of the community. This is why home ownership has always been the crude but effective American proxy for civic stake, not because a house makes a man virtuous, but because a man with a mortgage votes differently from a man without one. He attends the school board meeting because his property tax funds the school. He cares about zoning because it affects his street. He reads the bond measure because he will pay for it. The ownership is not the virtue. The ownership is the mechanism by which private interest and public interest are made to overlap, which is the oldest trick in republican governance and the one most essential to its survival. Perhaps you still have a stake, a house, a business, a profession whose practice depends on institutions that remain honest. If so, look around. 75% of American households cannot afford a median-priced home. An entire generation carries debt where their parents carried equity, rents where their grandparents held deeds. Only 6% of Americans belong to a civic group. Only 23% trust the government. 62% are dissatisfied with democracy itself. These are not the numbers of a disillusioned people. They are the numbers of a dispossessed one. And a republic of the dispossessed does not long remain a republic. It becomes, as Rome became, a system that the comfortable defend and the excluded ignore, until the day some man offers the excluded something simpler than self-governance. The previous 4 essays have asked what citizens owe the republic: honest argument, shared burden, epistemic humility, restraint of faith in the public square. These are real obligations and they remain binding. But this essay asks the prior question, the one that must be answered before any of those demands can be made with a straight face. What does the republic owe its citizens? not everything, not comfort, not equality of outcome, not protection from the consequences of foolish choices. A republic is not a parent, but a republic that asks its citizens to bear its burdens, to fund its wars, to staff its juries, to argue its arguments, to defend its constitution against enemies foreign and domestic, while offering a growing majority of them no stake in its prosperity, is not a republic. It is an extraction engine wearing constitutional clothing, and extraction engines do not inspire loyalty. They inspire the very withdrawal, cynicism, and susceptibility to demagogues that the founders designed the Constitution to prevent. America has restored this covenant before. It did so not out of charity, but out of structural necessity, because the republic cannot function without it. The Gilded Age demonstrated that the covenant will not maintain itself. The Progressive Era demonstrated that it can be rebuilt. The question is not whether restoration is possible. It is whether the political will exists, in a governing class that benefits from the current arrangement, to undertake it before the citizens whose stake has been dissolved conclude, as Rome's citizens concluded, that the republic is no longer theirs to defend. Every republic in history that has broken this covenant and failed to restore it has died. Not from foreign invasion, but from the quiet withdrawal of citizens who concluded that the republic was no longer theirs. Rome's citizens traded their political rights to Augustus because the republic had become an instrument of senatorial enrichment, and the Augustan bargain, stability in exchange for liberty, was rational for people who had nothing left to lose under the old arrangement. That is the bargain a broken covenant produces. It is rational and it is fatal. The covenant of stakes is not charity. It is not redistribution. It is not welfare. It is the precondition for self-governance itself, as old as the Roman ager publicus and as current as the median home price in any American city. A republic of stakeholders will argue, dissent, correct itself, and endure. A republic of spectators will watch, from rented apartments and subscription services, as the machinery of self-governance is operated by those who own it, in the interest of those who own it, until the day some clever man offers the rest of them bread and stability in exchange for the modest price of their participation. On that day, the experiment will not end with a crash. It will end with a shrug, and the citizens, having nothing to lose, will lose nothing they still recognize as theirs.